Our friend Teddy Cahill joins us from Baseball America. Teddy, good to catch up. Couple of weeks in the book. Got a few midweek games that are happening all across the country. Kind of a weird start to the college baseball season. We've had some weather issues, but we've also had some great weather. We've had some surprising outcomes, and there's been some really good stuff too. It's been an interesting start to the year.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, you're always going to get some upsets, especially when we throw in midweeks early in the season. But there haven't been a ton of big surprises yet. There haven't been a ton of big matchups yet, but there've been enough. And then this weekend, things really pop off with a lot of tournaments, a lot of rivalry series. This weekend should be really fun around the country.
Let's start this conversation here in Mississippi because there has been some disappointment. There are in some areas a little bit of optimism, in some areas a lot of pessimism about Mississippi State and Ole Miss. Plus, you've got Christian Ostrander, who's off to a pretty good start in his stint as the head coach at Southern Miss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to start there in Hattiesburg, they've got a big weekend ahead with Indiana State coming in. The Sycamores were undefeated before they took a pretty rough loss by the scoreboard to Vanderbilt last. But that one could be a pretty big deal. Two of the better programs, mid-major-wise, going at it. I'm very intrigued by that. And this has been up and down. Haven't really known what to think about them. The Hawaii series was tricky. They've got a big one against Iowa. And then Mississippi State, another, sometimes they look good, sometimes they don't look so good, and we're still just kind of trying to get a feel for what they are.
Are we deep enough in to have an understanding yet of what either Ole Miss or Mississippi State are? We'll start with Ole Miss since that's where you started. They go to Hawaii, they win the first two, and then they just play really poorly in the next two. And then that carries over after the travel where they lose a midweek game to Arkansas State. They lose the first game against High Point. But in their last three games, the offense has looked a whole lot more like what I think people thought it was going to look like. They've got some veterans in there, some guys that are proven, whether it's at Ole Miss or other places. What's the question for you? Is it about the offense or is it about the pitching?
I would say right now it's more about the pitching staff and finding consistency on the weekends. But that also was my bigger question coming in, and I just feel like it hasn't quite been answered yet. So if you're watching it up close and you're thinking well, this wasn't the offense I was promised, and now I'm worried about that because I was already worried about pitching, I would understand where that's coming from. But I do generally trust what's going on there. I think the Hawaii travel can catch teams sometimes. 4 games in Hawaii is a lot. Opening weekend especially. I'm not as worried about that as, what happened once they got back to Oxford. But it does seem like they're in a little bit better spot right now.
How big of a measuring stick is Iowa this weekend?
Iowa is going to come in with a high-end rotation. I mean, Brody Brecht on Friday night is arguably – he's right there with anybody in terms of stuff in the country. Command is more of his question. But Iowa is coming off of a really bad weekend in their tournament in Jacksonville, and their bullpen just was awful, frankly. So it's a measuring stick, and what you see in terms of rotation stuff is going to be similar to what you will see in SEC play. But Iowa seems like they have a not insignificant bullpen issues. So definitely a solid measuring stick, but there are some, things are going to have to be taken in context, I think.
So when we talked to Chris Lemonis on Monday this week about Mississippi State, he said he very much still believes in this offense, and that's what you would expect a head coach to say. But it's been a curious start to the year for Mississippi State in so much as there have been some days where the arms on the mound look great, but they couldn't score. And there have been some days where they swung the bats pretty well, but they couldn't pitch. And so kind of tying it all together seems to have been a bit of an issue for the Bulldogs so far.
Yeah, and I think that's just kind of early season stuff with so much new on the roster, I think things like that happen. I think that I'm also bullish on where the offense can get to. I think they have the talent there. The pitching at times, yeah, it looks really good. At times, it hasn't looked so good. And finding consistency on the mound, obviously, is the biggest thing for them. I think the offense will work into it, but right now it just hasn't all clicked for them yet.
Brian Haydad, who normally is on the show with us, he's out of town today. He's going to a wrestling event, Teddy. I mean, come on. He's skipping a day of work to go watch wrestling.
Is this pro wrestling or like high school wrestling?
This is not high school wrestling.
Okay, this is pro wrestling. I don't know about that one.
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
It's his thing, and he's got the days off, so that works. He has said numerous times that if Mississippi State loses more than about 5 games in the non-conference before SEC play rolls around, he doesn't see any way that they're a postseason team this year. Is that a reasonable litmus test, or does that not really line up for you?
Well, I mean, in terms of true raw data, there's obviously a path if they lose, even if they lose 5 games before the start of SEC play. You can always make up for that in SEC play. Now, the question is, if you're a team that's losing 5 games, are you going to be able to go out and then flip a switch in SEC play? And so I feel I don't know if 5's the right number, but I do understand why there would be concern if that happens. And I don't know, Mississippi, if you do that, if you start poorly, you have to find confidence at some point later in the season. But the way things have gone at Stark for the last 2 years, confidence is probably going to be tough to come by. So in SEC play, so you really need to build that going in. And again, I don't know that 5 is the right number or not, but that it does raise red flags if they're not playing better by the time conference play turns around.
Yeah, and Teddy, I wouldn't expect you to have their week-to-week SEC schedule memorized, but it is brutal. I mean, it is a brutal start to conference play. So we'll keep a close eye on that with Mississippi State. I'm curious if there is anybody in the SEC that has really popped off the page for you, even though we're only 8-9 games in.
I would say no at this point, in large part because nobody's really played enough good opponents to do that. I think Georgia at 8-0 is impressive, but you look at who they've played and, you suddenly get less impressed.
I guess the thing that's impressive right now is Charlie Condon, who's hitting almost 600.
Yeah, that's crazy. He has helped himself immensely in terms of draft stock. People are now talking about, could he go first overall, which if you told me that a month ago, that's just not where people were. They've got a big one this weekend against Georgia Tech. The competition would step up, a little bit better idea of, where they're at exactly.
And am I mistaken? I mean, isn't that 2 of the best hitters in the entire country that are going to be facing off with Condon and what he's done so far with Georgia, and the freshman at Georgia Tech that's got a bunch of home runs already?
Yeah, Drew Burris for Georgia Tech leads the nation in home runs with 9 after hitting 4 in a game yesterday, and then Condon leads the nation in hits. He's right up there in average, but he doesn't lead the nation in average. He has 2 hits in every game, and those 2 guys, it's a big offensive showdown in Georgia this weekend.
All right, so I think what I'm hearing you say, Teddy, is that when we talk a week from now, we're all going to have a little bit better feel for what this might look like just 2 weeks away at that point from the start of SEC play?
Yeah, I think that's fair. You look at what SEC teams have this weekend. There's 3 or 4 big rivalry weekends. You got a couple of teams going to tournaments, like LSU is going to Houston. We're going to know more. The first couple weekends have been pretty slow from an SEC standpoint, but we're going to know more soon, I think.
Teddy